Okay. Thank you all for being here, and senators who are in attendance virtually. And let me thank Shalanda Young, the acting director of OMB, for being with us. And let me thank Senator Graham for his help as ranking member. A federal budget speaks to who we are as a nation and where we want to be in the future. And I think, as everybody knows, this last year has been one of the worst years in our lifetimes for our country and, in fact, for the world. In the United States, we have endured the worst public health crisis in 100 years. We have lost over some 600,000 people to COVID, and we have also endured the worst economic collapse since the Great Depression of the 1930s. The very good news is I believe we are making significant progress in fighting our way out of both of those disasters. In terms of the pandemic, more and more Americans are being vaccinated, and the death rate is going down significantly. In my own state of Vermont, we're up to about 80% of our people have been vaccinated, and that type of trend is going on all over the country. Obviously, we still have an enormous amount of work to do, but the good news is we are making progress. Economically, we are also moving forward in the right direction. Millions of jobs have been created in the last few months as the economy reopens all across America. And one of the reasons, in my view, for our success has been the American Rescue Plan that the President signed into law in March. $1,400 direct payment that about 85% of our people received was enormously helpful in easing the anxiety and the pain and the distress that so many people were feeling. I don't know if any of you had the opportunity to talk to people who received those checks, but for a family of four, that was just life-saving. The American Rescue Plan, in a major way, has begun to cut childhood poverty because of the $3,600 child tax credit that we are providing to working families all across America. During the pandemic in my state, and I expect in all of your states, there were long lines of people lining up for emergency food. Hard to believe that's taking place in America. It was. We are making progress in reducing hunger in America. We are expanding, as a result of the American Rescue Plan, health care for people who need it. We're improving educational opportunities. We're providing summer and after-school programs for our kids. The American Rescue Plan provided an extra $300 a week in unemployment benefits to millions of workers who lost their jobs through no fault of their own. And the American Rescue Plan also is preventing millions of Americans from being thrown out onto the streets because they could not afford their rent. It is also preventing over 1 million workers and retirees from seeing their pensions slashed by up to 60%. In other words, that is a very significant piece of legislation that came at a time when working families in this country desperately needed help. But let us be clear. While we are making progress in protecting working families, an enormous amount of work remains before us. In the richest country in the history of the world, the working families of this country continue to struggle economically, with millions of our people continuing to live in desperation. Sometimes inside the Beltway, we can forget that reality. But literally speaking, 3 blocks from this building, there are people sleeping in tents out on the street, and the desperation exists from one end of this country to the other in every one of our states. Real wages, inflation accounted for wages in America, are lower today than they were 48 years ago. Think about that. Huge explosion in productivity, in technology, average American worker in real wages making less than he or she did 48 years ago. And frighteningly, and the young people know this, the younger generation stand an excellent chance, if we don't turn it around, of having a lower standard of living than their parents. In other words, we're moving in exactly the wrong direction. Today in America, over half of our people are living paycheck to paycheck, and millions are trying to get by on $8, $9, $10 an hour, which in my view is a starvation wage. In terms of health care, we remain the only major country on earth not to guarantee health care to all people, and yet we pay the highest prices in the world for health care. 90 million people are uninsured. 1 out of 4 people cannot afford the cost of a prescription drug their doctor prescribes because we pay the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. Over 500,000 Americans are homeless today, and some 18 million households spend at least half of their incomes in housing. How the hell do you survive when you're spending half of your income in housing? Meanwhile, while working families struggle, the very richest people in this country are doing unbelievably well. 2 people own more wealth than the bottom 40% of the American nation. And let me be as clear as I can be. The decisions that we make as a Congress will determine the very future of this nation. I'm not just talking about the movement toward authoritarianism and the attacks on democracy, which we are seeing every day. We are determining whether or not we are going to have an economy that works for all of us or just the very wealthiest people in this country. And in my view, the budget that President Biden has submitted to Congress constitutes a significant step forward for the working families in this country. Now, he has done his job, his staff has done their job. They have given us an excellent budget. It is our job to take that budget, to refine it, and to make it a document that works for all of our people. At a time when tens of millions of Americans continue to struggle economically, the president's budget would create millions of good-paying jobs, underline good-paying jobs, in this country by rebuilding our crumbling roads, bridges, water systems, wastewater plants. We have talked about infrastructure. Debbie, how many years have we talked about it? Decades since we have been here. Infrastructure, Republicans talk about it, Democrats talk about it. Every state in this country has a crumbling infrastructure. We have done nothing or very little. Now is the time to put our people back to work rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure. We need to build millions of units of affordable housing. We need to combat climate change. The scientists are very clear. Every day that we delay is another day that we endanger the well-being of our children and our grandchildren with more droughts, more floods, more extreme weather disturbances. That's the bad news. The good news is that we can create millions of good-paying jobs going forward in addressing climate change, and that is certainly incorporated in the president's budget. President's budget extends the child tax credit for at least 5 years. No, in America, we should not have the highest rate of childhood poverty of any major country on earth. And this budget takes us a good way forward in helping us to address that. This budget deals with the outrage that the pharmaceutical industry owns the United States Congress, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. For too many years, their lobbyists, their campaign contributions have resulted in the fact that we pay by far the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. The president's budget begins to tell the pharmaceutical industry, yeah, Medicare will negotiate prices. We can raise up to $500 billion, which, among other things, we can use to expand Medicare to cover dental, hearing, eyeglasses, and lower the age of eligibility. Millions of younger workers want to get into Medicare. By enacting universal child care pre-K legislation in the president's budget, we can make sure that every child in America, regardless of income or zip code, gets a good start in life. How absurd it is that we still, many of us, continue to live in the 50s where dad went to work and mom stayed home with the kids. Well, you know what, folks? Mom is working. Dad is working. And the children of this country are entitled to high-quality child care. That's what this president's budget begins to address. By passing paid family and medical leave, I believe we remain the only major country on earth, is that right, Ms. Young, that does not guarantee paid family and medical leave. Working mother has a baby today. She's got to go back to work in a week from now. Is that what a civilized society is about? Only major country on earth not to guarantee paid family and medical leave. This budget begins to move us in the right direction. This budget, the president's budget, begins to move us forward in terms of providing progressive tax legislation that finally asks the wealthy and large corporations to begin paying their fair share of taxes so we can begin not only to raise the revenue that we need, but to end the grotesque level of income and wealth inequality that exists in America. So here we are, folks. We have come to the worst year in our lifetimes. We are making progress, but I would hope that everybody recognizes that we still have a very long way to go. And I want to congratulate the President, Ms. Young, and the administration for giving us the framework of moving forward. Now, they've done their job. Now we've got to take the ball and run with it. We've got to refine that bill. It's not a perfect bill. That's our job. That's what the Congress does. So I look forward to working with my colleagues in the Senate and the House with the administration to make this just an extraordinary piece of legislation that finally addresses the needs of working families. Thank you. Senator Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our witness, welcome. I have a high respect and regard for you. Your budget, like every other president's budget, is probably not going to go very far, but that's just the way it is around here. And let me tell you why this budget probably won't go very far. There's some things you can fix. This budget's not one of them. What does this budget do? Over a 10-year period, it increases $5 trillion in additional spending. On top of what we're already spent, $5 trillion over 10 years. It raises taxes to $3.6 trillion. What does that mean for everybody working out there? This budget will come to your neighborhood soon. There's just not enough 1%ers to bear all the load of this. In terms of debt to GDP, we'll be at 117%, the highest since World War II. What does it do in terms of taxes? 20% of GDP will be taxes, the highest level in the history of country. And we're competing in a world where people are trying to be more competitive. Businesses can go anywhere in the world to do business, and I think a lot of them will be choosing another spot other than the United States because we'll drive them offshore. This tax and spend budget will break the back of our economy and will destroy future generations' ability to achieve the American dream that most of us have had a shot at, because we'll sink them with debt. We'll have an economy with tax structure that very few businesses will look to America as the place to locate. Other than that is fine. The real problem with the budget is on the defense side. You know this gun butter debate? There's enough butter in this bill to call a heart attack for everybody in the world. This is the most cholesterol-laden budget I've ever seen. 17% increase for non-defense spending. 1.6% increase for defense spending. In a dangerous world, this budget increases defense spending less than inflation. Increases non-defense spending by 17%. If you don't have a television, you need to buy one. Look what's going on in the world. The Iranians are marching toward a nuclear weapon, 60% enrichment. We have Russia rattling the neighborhood it lives in. Afghanistan, we're about to withdraw, and ISIS and unfortunately Al-Qaeda types are going to reemerge. We got North Korea threatening every day to expand their nuclear program. The Chinese are up to no good on every front. The incursions into friendly airspace by Russia and China at an all-time high. So our response is to basically neuter our defense capabilities. Mr. Chairman, how do you grow the Defense Department to compete with the technologies being developed by Russia and China if our defense spending is less than inflation? Their spending is not less than inflation. So this budget, I think, is blind to the world in which we live in terms of military threats. It has an approach to the role of the federal government that will destroy free enterprise. It will create a tax and spend policy in perpetuity that will make it very hard for the next generation of Americans to grow their own business, start their own business, and raise their families with some hope of acquiring wealth. 71% of all taxes in America are paid by people that make over $500,000. 53 million Americans pay zero federal income tax. Where are we headed? This budget, in my view, will destroy the ability to create new jobs in this country, will create a debt burden on future generations that would be devastating, and would, at a time of great danger, strip America of being able to maintain a qualitative edge over those who wish us harm. This is a very ill-conceived budget. It will get no support on this side, and I hope, working with Democrats and Republicans, we can find a way to have a budget that doesn't have 17% increase for non-defense and 1.6% increase for defense spending in this dangerous world in which we all live, and that we do not institutionalize tax rates and debt that are beyond the ability of the American people to flourish and survive. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Graham. Shalanda DeYoung is the Acting Director and Deputy Director of the Office of Management and Budget, and we're delighted that she is before us today. Ms. Young?
Thank you, Chairman Sanders, Ranking Member Graham, the rest of the distinguished members of the Budget Committee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to testify on the President's fiscal year 2022 budget request. We released this budget at a moment in our country where we're emerging from one of the most challenging periods in our history. At least 63% of American adults have now received one vaccine shot. The economy has added 2 million jobs since the president took office. The unemployment rate has dropped to 5.8%, the lowest since the start of the pandemic. A very encouraging sign is the decline in the long-term unemployed by 431,000 last month, as well as a decline in those seeking initial claims of unemployment by about half of what they were in January. And yet, we also know that it's not enough to simply go back to the economy we had before the pandemic. Instead, we must seize this moment to reimagine and rebuild a new American economy that invests in the middle class and those trying to break into the middle class. The President's fiscal year 2022 budget details his agenda for this year to help grow the economy, create good-paying jobs, and power an equitable economic recovery. It includes the two historic plans the President has put forth, the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan, and reinvest in education, research, public health, and other foundations of our country's strength through the discretionary request. And it does all of this while proposing tax reforms that will improve our country's long-term fiscal health and lay the foundation for shared prosperity in this country. The budget starts with the American Jobs Plan, a once-in-a-generation investment in America that will put millions of people to work rebuilding our country, fixing highways, rebuilding bridges, and upgrading our transit systems, replacing all lead pipes and service lines into our homes, and investing in the infrastructure of our care economy and creating new and better jobs for caregiving workers, and more. The budget also includes the American Families Plan, a historic investment to help families cover the basic expenses that so many struggle with now, lower health insurance premiums, and continue the historic reductions in child poverty that began in the American Recovery Rescue Plan. Alongside these investments, the budget also reiterates the President's strong call to Congress during his joint session to make progress on health care by reducing the cost of prescription drug and expanding and improving health coverage. Moreover, the budget details a robust set of discretionary proposals to help reinvest in the foundations of our strength and to begin reversing a decade of chronic underinvestments in priorities like public health. In total, the budget's discretionary investment would restore non-defense appropriations to its historical average share of the economy. Importantly, the budget makes all of these investments in a way that's responsive to both near and medium-term economic landscape and longer-term fiscal outlook. In the near term, the decades-long global trend of declining interest rates, gives us the fiscal space to make necessary upfront investments. Under the budget's policies, the real cost of federal debt payments will remain below the historical average through the coming decade, even as the budget assumes that interest rates will rise from their current lows, consistent with private sector forecasts. Over the long run, when we face larger fiscal challenges and more uncertainty about interest rates, the budget will reduce the deficit, improve our nation's finances. That's because its front-loaded investments are more than paid for through the permanent tax reforms that will ensure corporations and the wealthiest Americans pay their fair share. The budget policies reduce annual deficits beginning in 2030 and reduce deficits by over $2 trillion in the subsequent decade, while the American Jobs Plan and American Families Plan are fully offset within 15 years. As a whole, the President's budget will improve our nation's long-term finances while making the growth enhancement investments we need right now. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee today, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you very much. Ms. Young, let me start off with an issue that I've worked on for a long time, as others have, and that is the high cost of prescription drugs, the fact that the United States, through our Medicare program, does not negotiate drug prices. What does the President's budget do in terms of lowering drug prices and demanding that we get fair prices from the pharmaceutical industry?
Senator Sanders, the budget makes clear that the President expects action on this year, that we expect a bill from Congress that allows Medicare to negotiate drug prices that saves at least $500 billion for the American people because through lowering of drug payments, which you know is an extreme cost not only to beneficiaries but to taxpayers through the Medicare program.
To my mind, in the richest country on earth, it is hard to believe that millions of seniors don't have teeth in their mouths, don't have the hearing aids that they need, don't have the eyeglasses they need. What does the President's budget propose in terms of expanding Medicare?
Not only does the President want and expect action this year, as he called for in the joint address on prescription drugs, he expects those savings and others to be used to strengthen the Medicare and Medicaid programs with plans to enhance dental, vision, and hearing aid through those programs.
Ms. Young, you may be aware that, unbelievably, I hear my Republican colleagues talk about problems and somehow they forget issues like we have the highest rate of childhood poverty of almost any major country on earth, while the very rich are richer. What does this bill finally begin to do, the President's budget, in terms of childhood poverty in America?
One, it looks at the issues you brought up about women in the job force and a need for child care for all families that's affordable, equitable. So it invests heavily in child care spending. It reinvests in Head Start. Today, the discretionary budget serves 95,000 fewer children than it did 10 years ago. So it looks at a full picture to allow families to educate their children in a way that's fair to all families, no matter of income level.
Why is that important? I mean, I'm asking you such an obvious question, but some apparently still don't appreciate this. Why in today's economy is it important that we have a strong child care and pre-K system?
I'm here before you as a woman. Families look very different than they did 30 years ago. We need all the tools available to allow women and fathers to enter the workforce while not worrying about child care for their families.
The United States, I say to my colleagues, used to be the best educated country on earth. My memory is correct, we used to have the highest percentage of college graduates of any major country. That is no longer the case. Senator Graham mentioned that this is a very competitive economy, world economy. It certainly is. And you know what? You're not going to succeed in a competitive world economy unless we have the best educated workforce in the world. What does the President's budget do in terms of improving, allowing working families to get the higher education that right now they cannot afford?
This budget would allow two-year community colleges to be free for Americans, which we think is the appropriate thing to do. As the President has said over and over, we developed an education system decades ago that said 12 years was the right amount of years. We need to relook at that. And I think if we look at now what the educational requirements are for most jobs, that doesn't make sense anymore.
That's an area, by the way, we're going to maybe expand a little bit on what the president's ideas. I think we can go beyond community colleges, making them available to working families. My last question is, while some of my colleagues may not appreciate it, the scientists are pretty clear that climate change is an existential threat to this planet, that not only the United States, but China and countries, India, countries all over the world are going to have to work extremely aggressively to transform our energy system and in the process create millions of good-paying jobs. Ms. Young, what does the president's budget do in terms of finally getting us to move forward aggressively in climate change?
The discretionary budget invests $36 billion to combat climate change, an increase of $14 billion, Senator Sanders. Also at agencies you wouldn't typically think of, but all agencies are being impacted by climate change, including the Department of Defense, including the Small Business Administration. We have to look at this government-wide, and that's what this budget is doing. In addition, that's in addition to the billions of investments in climate change we're putting forth as part of the jobs plan.
All right, my last question is, there are communities all over this country, often communities of color, that have been ignored for many, many years. What does this president's budget do in terms of improving life in those communities?
Sir, you'll see an increased amount. We just talked about climate change and in the environmental justice space. This is an area we've put out an executive order requiring all agencies, as they implement, as they think about the budget, as they think about programs, that the government should work for all people, no matter their race, gender, and make sure we are providing equitable service to all Americans. So it goes beyond the budget, and ask agencies to relook at everything we're doing to make sure we're reaching all Americans.
Okay, Ms. Young, thank you very much. Senator Graham?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the job you do, and we'll try to work together here. Do you agree we need to fund the government this year?
Absolutely.
Do you agree we need some top lines sooner rather than later?
We have some for you here to consider.
Yeah, some that would work. If we say no to this, is that the end of the discussion?
Senator Graham, the budget has always been the beginning of a process.
Right. So you know that we're going to say no, and I think a lot of the Democrats will be uneasy with some of the priorities in this budget, or the lack of priorities in terms of defense. So I just want to encourage you, let's try to pass a budget. Fund the government through the appropriations process. We can do it. Do you agree that continuing resolutions are bad way to run the military and about everything else?
Everything else.
Okay. So the reason I want to beat you up on the budget is because I like you. And I'm trying to get to where we're all going to be. We're going to be here fairly soon as appropriators, trying to find a way to pass a budget that our colleagues can support. So I think Ms. Young is uniquely qualified to help us get there. And so when do you think we should have these discussions about a top line we could all agree upon?
Senator Graham, I know the House Appropriations Committee will start its work soon, hoping the Senate Appropriations Committee follows suit. And I think both bodies have to work their will, starting with where the president would like to see both go. But both have a history of putting member interests where members of both bodies can come together. It has to be a bipartisan process.
Okay, good. The sooner that process can start, the better, as far as I'm concerned. A bunch of states are basically canceling the federal unemployment benefit for their state because they believe it hinders the ability to hire people back as the economy reemerges from the COVID pandemic. Do you understand that logic, and what's your view of that?
Well, one, I'd like to state the way we do unemployment, the governors have the right to make those calls. But I'd also like to point out the jobs report we saw last week. Before any of these payments were pulled back, we saw what I think is tremendous growth in the jobs market. We added 559,000 jobs. We're down to the lowest unemployment level since before the pandemic. So we will see the results of what those governors have done, but we're also seeing a big return of the economy before that $300 was
Well,
pulled.
their belief is that the enhanced unemployment benefit is deterring people from re-entering into the workforce. There's a lot of jobs out there that are unfilled and will never be filled until you change the benefit structure. Does that logic make sense to you, given where we're at in our economy?
I understand the logic, but I've also not met Americans who would prefer not to work. There's a dignity to work in this country that most Americans
Well, I got a
have.
lot of people in my family that ain't working because they're getting, I'll show you some in my family. So bottom line is, I think there are people out there that are not bad people, but they're not going to work for $15 an hour if they make 23 unemployed. That doesn't make you a bad person. If you're working for $15 an hour, that makes you almost a chump. So, no, I don't buy that at all. I think there's a real problem we've created here to incentivize people not to work because simply they make more money. And I'm not blaming them, I'm blaming us. But our employers and our economy need some help out there. Finally, on the defense side, how do you see the world right now in terms of threats that the United States and our allies face? Is it small, large, medium?
While I'm not a national security expert, it's clear the world remains a complex place with a lot of dangerous players. But you being the State Foreign Ops Subcommittee Chair on appropriations, I think you have to look at this budget. I know we've gotten into the habit of looking at defense versus non-defense, but the investments in diplomacy, I think General Mattis said it best, a reduction there means he has to buy more bullets. So what you see when you don't see the defense numbers where you want them is a reinvestment in our diplomacy, making sure that this complex environment, this complex world we live in is not all handled militarily.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I'll end on this, Mr. Chairman. The President's budget, I think, ups the Foreign Ops Subcommittee, I think, to $62 billion. That's still less than 1%. Count me in for more spending on soft power. It does make sense. But it is by no means a substitute for having a robust military with a qualitative advantage over the enemies of this nation and our allies. And I can say one thing without any hesitation. This budget is a disaster for the American military over time. This budget will entice bad actors to be more bold. And this budget sends absolutely the wrong signal in a dangerous world. While I appreciate more developmental aid spending, we're not going to defend America through developmental aid spending. Our adversaries are growing in capability. This budget does not allow us to stay ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Grimm. Senator Stabenow.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Ms. Young, welcome again. I first want to start because I'm sure we're going to hear from Republican colleagues now that we have a Democratic president about how deficits will destroy the country, and which is always happening under a Democratic president, but not under a Republican president. So just in the time that I've been here, just for the record, for folks listening, I came into the U.S. House in 1997, and President Clinton, Democrat, balanced the budget for the first time in 30 years. I was proud to be able to do that. Came into the Senate, President Bush, 2 tax cuts geared to the wealthiest Americans, wars not paid for, huge deficits. Nobody said anything about the deficits. Went into a financial crisis at the end of his term. President Obama comes in, right-sizes the government, the financial crisis. Suddenly deficits matter again. They're horrible and will ruin the country. By the end of his term, deficits are coming down. President Trump comes in, deficits really don't matter. Everything gets exploded in terms of the deficits. Republican colleagues don't say anything. But now we have President Biden and deficits matter again. So I think we ought to just say, as we hear this going forward, understand where it's coming from. I want to thank you for a budget that reflects the needs and values of the people of Michigan. I want to thank you for supporting the Great Lakes. It's the first time in 5 years I haven't had to come to the Budget Committee and talk about how eliminating the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative would be a bad thing for protecting the Great Lakes. So thank you for investing in that that as well. I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about closing the tax gap, I think, which is so important. President Biden's proposed a significant investment in the IRS ability to enforce the tax laws on the books. I think everybody in my state thinks that's a good idea, and if they're required to pay their taxes, that everybody should be required to pay their taxes, and it's pretty simple. People should pay what they owe. Every year, there are hundreds of billions of dollars in taxes that are owed that aren't paid. In fact, in the Finance Committee, I was really amazed to hear the former IRS commissioner say he thinks it's $2 trillion in unpaid taxes. And when you look at it, it's unreported income, it's income hidden because of complex business arrangements and so on, and compounded by staffing cuts over the years that have made it harder to do complex tax-consuming audits. And the result is that low-income taxpayers with a simple tax filing get audited. A billionaire with complicated finances have a much better chance of not being audited. And so when we're looking at roads and bridges and education and healthcare and Department of Defense and all the things that we need to fund, these are big numbers. So I wondered if you would talk more about the role that revenue from closing the tax gap plays in funding the critical investments that I'm sure everybody will be talking about this morning.
So, Senator Stabenow, we do pay a lot of attention on the spending side without pointing out the president's proposal is completely offset through tax reform. Also, before you even get to tax reform, through asking those who are supposed to pay a certain amount of tax to pay that. The IRS has been woefully underfunded for decades, the last decade even more, thanks to the Budget Control Act. So we're saying, you said $2 trillion, we're tracking closer to $1 trillion. That's what people owe under these tax laws with no changes. So we do think we need robust investments in the IRS to make sure that regular Americans are not paying their fair share, while those under our current laws are getting away without paying anything into the system close to what they owe. And then we have to skimp on these investments in infrastructure and childcare.
Yep.
Thank you very much. Well, on behalf of the people of Michigan, we need to get that done. People want to make sure our tax system and enforcement is fair. One other question, many I'd love to talk to you about, but I want to talk to you more about what we've talked about privately in terms of a really important piece of healthcare, which is behavioral health, healthcare above the neck, mental health, substance abuse services, and so on. We've had dramatically positive things happening through new certified community behavioral health clinics. Senator Roy Blunt and I, Republican, Democratic colleagues together, pushing forward on a new way to provide quality services in the community that keep people out of the jail. Instead, they're getting help out of the emergency room, out of the homeless shelters, getting help. The budget includes a $125 million increase in startup funds, but doesn't address the need to make these clinics fully available and funded across the country. So I wonder if you could speak to some of the successes of this approach in community clinics, and will you work with Senator Blunt, myself, and other colleagues to make sure that we can put in place the legislation necessary to provide these services across the country?
Briefly.
Yeah, Senator Stabenow, as I said privately, of course, we'll work with you to make sure we get the right mix and are servicing people the best way when it comes to behavioral and mental health. So we'll absolutely work with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Grassley.
Yeah, I don't have an easel, so I want to show you a 50-year history of taxes and taxes coming into the federal treasury, just to show you that your wish of getting more revenue from higher tax rates just doesn't pay off. The blue line is a 50-year history of tax rates, up and down. The red line is the actual revenue that actually comes in, which tells me that the history over 50 years is that the taxpayers in this country have decided they're only going to give us in Washington so much money, averaging about 17 4/10% of gross national product. Now, you want to raise that about 20% to an average of about 19.9, I believe. It just isn't going to happen. People are going to decide that they're going to take leisure instead of working for the government. They've decided that this is the amount of money that's going to come in. And so taking this into consideration, how do you think you're going to fund with the tax rates you get? You're suggesting that money's going to come in, but it doesn't come in.
Senator Grassley, one, I think I need some of the visual aid that Senator Sanders talked about earlier, but from what I can see of the lines, I think not all, but partly can be explained by what I just talked to Senator Stabenow about. We need to make sure that we have an IRS, a government that is collecting what the tax law says we should be collecting. And some people absolutely do not pay what they're supposed to pay, not because they're staying home, because they have found loopholes that we are beginning to close in this budget. So, I think it is troubling, the line you've shown, and we are trying to do something about that to make sure people are paying what the tax law says they're supposed to pay, and it's usually the very wealthy who find loopholes that we need to close.
The president, on another matter, the president's budget tries to justify unprecedented levels of spending and debt by assuming interest rates will remain historically low. Recently, Secretary Yellen is quoted as saying interest rates have been, quote, too low now for a decade, unquote, and that we should welcome higher rates. But if interest rates do increase, that could be a catastrophic given escalating debt under the president's budget. As Brian Riedel of the Manhattan Institute recently highlighted in testimony before the House Financial Services Committee, interest rates that are only 1 percentage point higher than CBO currently projects would add $30 trillion of interest costs over the next 3 decades. Given Secretary Yellen's recognizes the potential of higher interest rates, doesn't proposing a budget that results in public debt reaching 117% of GDP by 2031 and continues to rise thereafter risk leading us down the path that we've seen in other countries? Greece is an example. I suppose Italy would be another example towards a debt crisis.
Senator Grassley, one, I'd like to point out what we tried to do is present a reasonable budget that was honest about our assumptions. So we do actually include a rise in interest rate over time in this budget. When it was developed, it was absolutely in line with where market forecasters are. Even with that, we show a deficit savings of $2 trillion in the subsequent decade from this budget. We also see some rise in interest that are month-to-month temporary, but we also see our long-term indicators showing us it will not be a long-term issue and we remain at historically low points, which is a good thing because our real debt service payments remain low by historical standards. So we do account for rising interest, and we do still show $2 trillion in deficit savings with the budget proposals, with the offsets and tax reforms we've talked about today.
Since the end of World War II and prior to the pandemic, spending as a percent of GDP exceeded 24% of GDP in only 1 year. That was 2009 at the height of the financial crisis, when spending reached 24.4% of GDP. That was in 2009. Under the president's budget, spending as a percentage of GDP would average 24.5% for the next decade. It seems to me that if the administration is taking the concept of, quote, unquote, never letting a crisis go to waste to a whole new level, how does the administration justify permanent spending levels that once were reserved only for periods of world wars or economic crisis?
Senator Grassley, what we see, one, our proposals here are fully offset. We may not agree on the offsets, but we took the responsible route of providing offsets. We also know that the change in demographics in this country means that we spend more, but we think it's important to make sure our seniors know we have a commitment to those social safety net programs like Social Security. So you will not find cuts to those programs here. But our changing demographics have as much to do with the GDP numbers, as you've mentioned, as the proposals here. But to ensure that we don't create more of a fiscal problem down the road, we do believe these policies should be offset by reforming the tax code so it is more fair to all Americans.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Ms. Young. I want to talk about budget honesty. I appreciate this about the budget in a couple of ways. Your spending proposals are offset with proposed revenue increases. That's good. You don't propose a defense number, but then have a president who wants to take money out of the Pentagon to use for non-military projects like a wall. President Trump took about $12 billion out of the Pentagon to use for the wall. So while the top line for defense may only go up a little, actually, if you count in the fact that President Biden isn't going to raid the defense budget for non-military emergencies, it's actually a larger increase in defense spending within the Pentagon. And let's get to this. You use fairly conservative revenue forecasts. So you projected trillions of dollars of deficit savings over the 2 decades using conservative revenue forecasts. Now, as I read the budget, what it suggests to me is this. We're still in the middle of a once-in-a-century public health crisis that's killed 600,000 people and ravaged the economy. We're seeing some signs of growth. That's good, but we're not out of the woods yet. And so you include conservative revenue projections, and maybe the most recent evidence would suggest that the growth will actually be stronger. Wouldn't you agree with me that one of the best ways to deal with debt and deficit is to have strong economic growth?
Absolutely, and the growth numbers we have for this year, upcoming year is 5% in the budget. We developed those economic assumptions in February. Clearly, our vaccine program has outperformed our greatest thoughts on what it would, and it's allowed the economy to grow. OECD and other forecasters now estimate that our growth will be more like 6.5%. So there are very conservative estimates here. Even with those, we show deficit reductions. And there's proof through market forecasters and others that we're doing better than even this budget.
And when the time is right, you can come back to Congress. If you feel like you need to adjust the revenue projections, you can come back to us. And we might even see the anti-deficit effect that you testified earlier being even stronger because of the potential for robust growth.
We're required to do something called a mid-session review, and I certainly don't want to get ahead of myself, but given where the market is and market forecasters, I expect we'd see much stronger growth.
On the theory that economic growth is the best anti-deficit strategy, I also want to point out analyses for the last decade have always indicated that comprehensive immigration reform is something that you can do that will significantly increase economic growth without really adding a penny to the deficit. And it would be my hope that we would grapple with that. If we're interested in fiscal responsibility, comprehensive immigration reform is one of the most important things we could do. I am right, am I not, that President Biden is not proposing to raid the Pentagon budget to take money out of it for non-defense emergencies. Am I correct in that?
You're correct, absolutely correct.
Over the course of about a year in the calendar year, it straddled 2 fiscal years, President Trump took $12 billion out of the Pentagon budget, and so the top-line numbers that Ranking Member Graham showed actually were sort of artificial. Those were indeed top lines. That didn't reflect what was actually spent by the previous administration because they spirited monies away. Senator Graham also talked about the notion that the discretionary budget was increasing at a significant percent. The money on diplomacy is in the discretionary budget, but it is important to the national defense, correct?
Right.
The Department of Energy, which is over our nuclear arsenal, really important to national defense, but that's in the discretionary budget, isn't it?
right.
DHS is in the discretionary budget, very important for national security, isn't that correct? Department of Justice, Drug Enforcement Administration. There are so many parts of the discretionary budget that are critical to national defense that just simply looking at defense versus non-defense and saying one is benefiting and the other is not is sort of artificial and not particularly accurate, isn't it?
It is a completely artificial split.
Last thing I want to ask you is, in the past administration, we often saw efforts, I thought, to really go after federal employees by limiting cost of living increases, by undercutting retirement benefits. Tell me about what this budget does for our federal employees.
So one, it provides a adequate cost of living increase of 2.7%.
And that is parity for both defense and non-defense employees,
It makes
correct?
no sense that someone sitting next to someone in a uniform would not have parity, or that a CIA intelligence
Or a
officer-
Coast Guard officer serving
That's
on a
right.
Navy ship, they would get different pay increases. That
Correct.
makes no sense, does it?
It does not.
Yeah, so parity, that's strong.
We do parity in this budget. The president is very clear. The government works for the people, and we have to have a strong civil service, rebuild that service. Just at OMB, we've seen the reduction in staff over the last 10 years. It has significant impacts on what we're able to do for the American people, and we have every intention to turn that around.
Thank you, Ms. Young. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Kane. Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Young, welcome. Real quick, how much approximately is left unspent from the close to $6 trillion of COVID relief that Congress has passed over the last 18 months?
Senator Johnson, you know ARP was just passed, so a significant amount of that remains unobligated, but I can get that for the committee.
Well, the reason I ask is when we passed the $1.9 trillion, put air quotes, COVID relief package, there's about $1 trillion left unspent of the previous $4 trillion spent in 2020. According to the numbers I saw from CBO, about $700 billion of the COVID relief package, the $1.9 trillion partisan package, isn't even going to be spent till 2022 to 2028. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it's appropriate to make sure we roll these programs out in a responsible way.
But that's not COVID relief. That's something else.
It absolutely is. COVID relief can take time to get out to ensure that some long-term inequities that will last past the pandemic are dealt with.
Okay, well, I hope COVID's over before 2028. Can you give me that number, though? I'd like to know, as of today, how much of the $6 trillion of COVID relief remains unspent.
We'll make sure all the members on the committee have that data.
Just real quick, because you're talking about equity and taxes. Right now, the top 1% make about 21% of income, and they pay 40% of the income tax. The top 10% make about 48% of the income, and they pay 71% of income tax. And by the way, the top 1% will always make a larger share of income, because that's the definition of 1% and definition of 10%. What do you think would be more equitable? Again, top 1%, 20% of income, they pay 40% of tax. Top 10%, they make 48% of income, pay 71% of the income tax. What do you think would be more equitable? What should those percentages be?
Senator Johnson, the question I have is they're paying the percentages. Let's take your numbers are fact. That doesn't mean that they're paying a fair share compared to what regular Americans.
So again, if you're making, let's concentrate on the top 10%. If you're making almost 50% of the income, what percentage of the income tax should you pay?
What we are suggesting is that the wealthiest Americans go back to paying what they paid before the tax cuts of the last administration. So we are moving those tax rates back to 39.6%.
What do you think is the maximum amount any American should pay out of $1 of income to the federal government? Recognizing certain states take 10% or even more. But what should be the maximum amount an American should pay for every $1 of income should contribute to the federal government? What should that percent be?
So we have a tax plan. What it says is no one that makes under $400,000 should pay more than they paid now. So we have a commitment not to raise those taxes. But what we're saying is those that make more than $400,000 should pay.
But what's that percent? I mean, what do you think? So what is the percent that an American will pay out of $1 of income?
Senator John, overall, we think the right tax rate is 39.6% for the top rate.
So about 40%, okay. Senator Stabenow was talking about the glory years of budget surpluses, which, trust me, I wish we were back there in the late Clinton years. The reason we got there is, first of all, extremely strong economy through the 1990s. And I would argue that was set up by what Ronald Reagan did in terms of supply-side economics and setting up the conditions for business investment. So revenue actually did grow in 2000 to 20% of GDP. But that was short-lived. Because Senator Grassley is right. Long-term, no matter what the top marginal tax rate, we get about 17.4%. That's kind of what the American people in the end say that's about all we're going to pay in, and they figure out some way to avoid paying the high top marginal tax rate. But the reason we had the surpluses is because spending was 18.5, 18, 17.7, 17.7% of GDP during those 4 years. Now, historically, it's gone up during recessions, like in the 83, early 80s to about 22.9. The first 4 years of President Obama, again, he came to office with the recession, it was 24 to about 22%. Last 4 years was about 20.8%. The president's budget is calling across the board for 24.5% spending of GDP. Don't you think that is way too much?
So one, I'll point out that those times that Senator Stabenow you mentioned, the top tax rate was 39.6%. So we're trying to go back to those levels. So, we talk about spending as the problem. One thing we think we should do is change the tax rates to make sure we do go back to fair rates at a time of a strong economy. And we don't think people are paying their fair share. We've seen that in the data. We've had a tax cut that did not do what we claimed it would do. So we are trying to go back and make sure that the top earners and corporations do something to make sure we can spend on
Just
infrastructure.
Final point, that what I was pointing out, those outlays are going from averaging about 20% in the last 4 years around Obama to 24.5%. That's a massive amount of spending increase. When we have, let's face it, a very strong economy, 5.8% unemployment. When I went to college, that was almost considered full employment. In my state, it's 3.8%. I just don't get all this spending when we're $28 trillion in debt. But thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Toomey should be available on video.
I am. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first point I would make is our distinguished witness, I think, misspoke, suggesting that she'd like to go back to the wealthy paying the share of the tax burden they paid prior to the TCJA. If we went to that, then the wealthy would pay a lower percentage of all the taxes that are paid, because when we did the tax reform of 2017, the TCJA, we shifted the tax burden from middle income people to higher income people. We made the tax code more progressive than it was prior to the TCJA. So unless I'm mistaken, I think the administration's position is that they want wealthier people to pay even more, not less, of the tax burden. So I just want to make that clear. So this budget that we have before us, of course, massive increase in non-defense discretionary spending, almost 17%. That's on top of the $1.9 trillion of partisan spending that was signed into law in March. The Biden proposal never returned spending to pre-pandemic levels as a percentage of our economy. For 50 years, average spending has been about 20% of GDP, just a little more than that. Under the president's budget, spending remains at about 25% of GDP. So it's a massive 25% increase in government spending as a percentage of the economy, which would be a huge distortion and misallocation of resources. To pay for part of these spending hikes, we've got huge tax increases. The president's proposing we increase the corporate rate, we double GILTI, we eliminate the foreign-derived intangible income, which is a way to encourage taxes paid in the U.S. instead of overseas, raise individual income tax rates, eliminate the stepped-up pay. It goes on and on. All kinds of tax increases of all sorts. And one of the ironies of this was that I wish we could all agree on certain facts that are indisputable. And one of them is that prior to the hit of the pandemic, prior to that, we had the best economy in 50 years. And that's if you measure it by objective metrics. We were at full employment. We had more job openings than there were people looking for jobs. We had a record low poverty rate. We had all-time record low unemployment for African Americans, for Hispanic Americans. Wages were growing, and not only were wages growing, but they were growing fastest for the lowest income people. So we were actively witnessing a narrowing of the income gap. I would have thought that there could be bipartisan agreement that those are good things, because I think those are very good things. And therefore, I think it'd be good to try to get back to that. But that's not where we go here. Instead, we go on this massive spending and tax hike binge that would make it probably impossible to ever get back to the best economy of the last 50 years, which we had a year and a half ago. Now, along the way, because of the government having shut down the economy for understandable reasons, even if not always best in hindsight, in 2020, Congress passed 5 bills, $4 trillion. Then the Democrats insisted on another almost $2 trillion. It was clear already that the economy was roaring back. COVID was already receding dramatically. We had discovered by then, before then, that states had an all-time record year for funds for tax revenue in 2020. State and local governments combined set an all-time record. Separate and apart from that, we had sent them $500 billion. And then the administration says we have to send them another $350 billion, of course. It's just unbelievable, the spending everywhere you look. California is a great example. Here we go. In California, they announced that this fiscal year, they've run a $75.7 billion surplus. That's just their surplus. But they're going to get another $42 billion from the federal government. So they don't know what to do with all this money. They're going to send checks out. So here's one thing that I've suggested is that since there's bipartisan agreement on physical infrastructure spending, why not spend some of this money that's been approved, but it hasn't gone out the door? I think our witness testified that much of it couldn't possibly have been spent yet. I agree with that. But I have a concern, and my concern is how much detailed information we have about what is actually available to be repurposed. So if the administration is really proud of the achievements of the American Rescue Plan, and presumably confident that the American people would support this massive spending blowout, even though the economy was recovering and COVID was receding, my question is, why haven't you provided the reports and the drawdown reports right down to account level detail, reports that, by the way, the Trump administration did provide to members of Congress and staff so that we can see exactly how much has been spent and how much is yet to be spent? Acting Director Young, could you explain to me why we haven't been able to get that information from you?
In 25 seconds or
Yeah,
less.
Senator Toomey, I think I told Senator Johnson, happy to provide that information. I also understand the relitigation of ARP, but I will remind everyone that in March, close to 55,000 Americans were still contracting COVID every day. And 11.
Okay, all right, I'm out of time, but really, you should be posting this information. It should be available in as close to real time as possible. We shouldn't have to wait for a hearing to ask you to provide the information about how quickly money is being spent.
Thank you. Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Director, for your leadership. Just on the ARP, as we know, actually there are some funds that have already been exhausted. I think the restaurant fund that have been set up and others have been oversubscribed. Monies that went to local and state governments were not intended to be out the door and spent right away. I know many of my local governments are putting together good plans to make sure those monies are very well spent. Thank you for the budget request that was submitted by the Biden administration. I want to talk about education funding for one moment, because I appreciate the proposed increases in some fundamental education programs. What we've seen over years, when both Democrats and Republicans have been in the majority, is chronic underfunding of our federal education funds. Last year, Title I was underfunded by $29 billion just in 1 year. And IDEA was underfunded by $23 billion. So that's the gap between what Congress authorized and said was necessary from a policy perspective to provide our kids with a quality education compared to what we actually delivered. In fact, I've introduced legislation. It's been my first bill every year in Congress. I'm glad to see a budget now that is proposing some of the increases contained in that bill. Also pleased to see the focus on community schools because we want our teachers to be focused on teaching. But we all know that many kids come into the classroom with lots of other challenges and issues. And so community schools are the right model. So can you just talk a little bit about the increases? You got a $20 billion increase in Title I, equity grants, $2.6 billion in IDEA, which has had bipartisan support, $443 million in full-service community schools. Can you just talk about how this supports an opportunity agenda for the country?
One, point out that 90% of the children in this country go to public school. So the investment here is absolutely necessary. I think you pointed out there's been historically bipartisan support for many of this education budget. $20 billion increase for Title I schools. IDEA, as you pointed out. We think you also have to look at our preschool investments, so we get children early childhood. As we've seen, kindergarten is too late. You've missed the boat if you're waiting to kindergarten. So we're trying to make sure that children, especially those at risk, have access to quality education as young as we can find them. And I think this budget is transformational. It's a first step, but we certainly hope Congress takes this and runs.
I agree with you, and I want to ask you also about the issue of long-term unemployment. You have $4 billion in here to create subsidized job programs for short periods of time to help the long-term unemployed get back on their feet. We had over, about 1.5 million people long-term unemployed even before the pandemic hit. We're well over 4 million. Even as we come out of the pandemic, I'm very nervous that many people are going to be unable to find work and looking for a very long time. So this is not a radical idea. I remember back in 2010 during the economic meltdown, no less a flaming liberal than Governor Haley Barbour at the time thought that this was a really important program. And I do think that to address the chronic issues of long-term unemployment, not just after a pandemic or after a meltdown like we saw in 2008, we have that ability for people who are looking for work, they want to support their family, they're out there. That's by definition, they're looking to help them with a leg up. Can you talk briefly about that?
Yeah, while we see some indicators that we're doing better here, over 400,000 removed from the rolls of the long-term unemployed. They're long-term unemployed because it's historically been difficult to find jobs, and they're the most likely to be left behind as the economy takes that out. There are always inequities in our economy. That's why you see the Jobs and Families Plan. It's not just a recovery from COVID. It's to make sure we take this opportunity to build an economy that is fair for all Americans, and that program you've highlighted absolutely targets a community that would absolutely be left behind, stay on the rolls of the unemployed. And we need targeted investments for that community and others to make sure there's fairness in our economic system.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Brunn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I get into the general discussion that Senator Toomey and Senator Johnson had a moment ago, something's been conspicuously absent from the discussion of raising revenues, and that'd be the qualified tax deduction for small businesses that was put in place in 2017, that in effect took small business rates from 40% down to 39.6 to 29.6. Is that something you believe, even though it's due to sunset in 2025, should remain there? Or do you believe when that was differentiated in the ordinary rate between individuals and small business income, that ought to be something that stays in place? I'd love to hear your answer and be on record of where you would like to go there.
Yeah, Senator Brown, not surprisingly, I'll point out that there are a lot of things we did not speak to with TCJA, with expirations in 2025. We believe we have between now and then to deal with some of those expiring provisions. That is one of them, so I'm not going to get ahead of where we might.
Do you have an opinion on that in terms of has it been beneficial in terms of driving the economy pre-COVID?
One, I think we need to see where Congress ends up with the tax proposals we have to date to see where we end up for a 2025 budget. I'm not going to get ahead of that.
So as a Main Street entrepreneur, I'll tell you, and been doing it 37 years prior to becoming a senator, that was clearly the biggest driver When you look at corporate income taxes going from 35 to 21, I believe that that particular tax adjustment was behind why we were creating record revenues pre-COVID. Keep that in mind. When it comes to this discussion of having any chance to pay for the additional spending, which correctly was pointed out, averages about 20% of our GDP, now 24. Even with all of the tax increases proposed, you still will be adding to the structural deficit. Implicit in all of this, and I think to be honest with the American public, is that we choose to borrow this from our kids and our grandkids. Do you think that is healthy public policy to spend in that fashion when we're really asking future generations to pay for it? Because since I've been here, anything that's done defers something to 6 to 10 years down the road, spends like crazy in the present. We do not do offsets, which means we're willing to borrow from our kids and grandkids. Do you buy that as good policy long term?
Senator Brown, I buy that there are puts and takes in every decision in life, and we better do something about our infrastructure, our education, our systemic unfairness in the tax system, or we do risk future generations being worse off.
So I'll take that as a declaration that you are willing to borrow from future generations on end to get these policy proposals across. I'd point out that that doesn't work anywhere else. In any state government, it doesn't work in any entity that's got the rigor of competition in the private sector, and it's a very poor example of what we do at a place that so many people look to, so many businesses do. And I think it sets us up as a bad business partner for any of the good policy that we choose to pursue, whether it's infrastructure, education, any of the things that people look to the federal government maybe to do more of. This ends up with a series of crises down the road, maybe starting with completely depleting the Medicare trust fund here in a little over 5 years. Social Security, the other driver of our structural deficits along with Medicaid, all might be good policy that we've kind of woven into our fabric. That's all at risk as well. So I think that as long as we're on this pathway, we need to be honest about it and to also acknowledge that we were at the sweet spot of maybe what government should do pre-COVID, based upon especially that incentive built into making the productive economy healthy with that qualified income tax deduction for small businesses. I don't think you can paint this in any other way other than it ends up with a calamity. And even though it feels good in the short run that we're spending money on so many things all of us are interested in, but it's derelict to the American public to do it when we're borrowing every penny of it. Because let's face it, raising taxes, that's not near as certain as spending the money at the tune of creating these $1.5 trillion, $1.5 trillion deficits and the debt that it adds in the future. I think that's part of what journey you're on.
Thank you, Senator. I see we're out of time, but I'll just point out that we absolutely agree. You should pay for your proposals, and that's what we do here, and I get there are disagreements, but we have put forward a set of proposals that would pay for the spending.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Murray.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Acting Director Young, welcome. Good to see you today. I was really pleased to see President Biden's budget lay out a plan to make our economy actually work for working families and not just those at the very top. I think we all know that the budget is really a reflection of our values and our priorities, and this budget really pushes forward strong investments in our workers, in our families, in our kids, that's going to help our communities succeed in our present and in the future. So my question for you today is, with everything we have learned during this pandemic, coupled with the erosion in wages and living standards that lower and middle class families have experienced over the last actually 40 years plus, why are the investments included in the American Families Plan critical to make sure all our workers and families can share in the economic recovery? And what is the economic case for taking these very decisive actions now?
Thank you, Senator Murray. We've talked about this, touched on this a little, but I'd like to make clear We are recovering. The economy is roaring back. What the Jobs Plan and Families Plan are intended to do is take this opportunity to make sure we do better than we were pre-pandemic. Those without college educations, that they have good paying jobs, that we fundamentally give everyone in this country an opportunity, that we admit that there were inequities in the system before the pandemic, that the pandemic highlighted, that we do better about with our opportunity here. So there's we are recovering from COVID. We think ARP gave us a leg up, given where we are in vaccines, but we have an opportunity here to make sure everyone can take part in the American dream, maybe in a way that they weren't able to do before the pandemic. So we've been talking about infrastructure for a long time. The president's talked about Infrastructure Week since he was a member of this distinguished body. He'd like to stop talking about it and do something about it. And I think most Americans feel the same way, and we'd like the chance to put forward a proposal while asking the wealthiest Americans, while asking big corporations to pay their fair share.
Well, thank you. And I think we need both the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan if we want to build back a fairer and a stronger economy on the other side of this pandemic. So before I close, I just wanted to raise two issues of critical importance to my home state of Washington, and that is the cleanup of the Hanford nuclear site and efforts to restore the salmon runs in the Pacific Northwest. It was really good to see this administration move away from the harmful cuts that have been proposed within the environmental management account at the Department of Energy, and I want you to know I look forward to continuing to work in close partnership with you to make sure the Hanford mission is on a cost-effective trajectory without compromising the cleanup. And on salmon recovery, I was really pleased to see an increase in funding for NOAA and continued funding for the Pacific Coastal Salmon Recovery Fund. On that issue as well, I look forward to working with you closely and the administration to save salmon in the Pacific Northwest. And I'm really committed to continuing and expanding funding for direct recovery projects, including habitat restoration, hatchery infrastructure, culvert repair and replacement, as well as some of the other investments that will really contribute towards species recovery, like clean water infrastructure and more clean energy capacity and storage solutions. So I really appreciate your looking at that and look forward to working with you on all of that.
And just like Senator Stabenow talked about the Great Lakes, we're proud of the work that Puget Sound has done for cleanup, and we know how important salmon is in the Pacific Northwest, including the tribe. So we look forward to being a partner there.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Scott.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Young, for being here. What are going to be what do you think our federal receipts will be in this fiscal year?
Senator, let me see if the team has the exact number, but
I think it's just a little, I think it's estimated to be a little less than 3.5 trillion. And then for next year, I think your budget would suggest that we're going to get 4.1 trillion. Does that sound right?
no, I have it as a percent of GDP, so that would not equal up to yours. But historically, post-war average, 17.2% of GDP are receipts, and our 10-year average is 19.3.
So if you look at the way I think about it is, you're going to go from little less than 3.5 trillion to over 4.1 trillion dollars. I think that's about a 17% increase in receipts in 1 year. You think we've ever done that? A 17% increase in federal reserve? I've never seen it.
Well, if we take the investments we have offered for IRS and others to make sure we collect what the federal government has asked of people, what the tax law says, that is our hope to increase it by that much.
I've never seen the federal government be able to increase its receipts by 17% in 1 year. And so I think what you said when Senator Brown asked you that your belief is that we ought to do everything we can to live within our budget and pay for things. So let's assume that the Senate doesn't pass all these tax increases. What would you do? How would you deal with your budget then?
I mean, Senator Scott, I can make a lot of predictions, but my guess is if the Senate doesn't pass the offsets, the spending is also in danger. So we'd have to see the full package that the Senate and House would move on.
So right now, we're getting close to $30 trillion total debt. I think public debt is over $24 trillion, which is bigger than our GDP, right?
Yeah.
So if you look at that now, if you look at, I think the 10-year average for Treasury is over 5%, right? So your projection after this year of we're going to see, I guess, it looks like people are talking about 6% increase, but after that it'd be 2% or less per year of GDP growth.
Yeah, and as I talked to Senator Kane about, we've seen growth since these budget estimates were assumed, so you should expect some update of that through our mid-session review.
So how do we ever balance a budget if we already have our federal debt in excess of our GDP, if our GDP is going to grow around 2%, and realistically, we're not going to have low interest rates forever. As a matter of fact, we've been at a historical low, so if you look at history, things go to above actually historical averages. So how would we ever get a balanced budget? And if we don't, how's that going to impact our poorest families with inflation?
Yeah, Senator Scott, there are a lot of assumptions in there. I would, in that scenario, I would question including the interest rate. We're not seeing long-term indicators that show we're going back to the 70s with interest rates. So we do think we have the fiscal space to make these investments, but we also do believe that you have to put forth a proposal to pay for these investments over time, which is why we've done that. So we are reducing the deficit. But as you know, we have an aging society, which is part of the structural growth in spending we're not addressing, because we don't think we should be cutting Social Security and Medicare at this time. And if the choice is between that and asking the wealthiest to pay more, that's what we need to do.
So we know that the Medicare Trust Fund and Social Security Trust Fund they're clearly depleting. So what did you do in the budget with regard to them?
So the budget, actually, I'm glad you brought this up, suggests that we would switch to the general fund to pay for those programs, so benefits would not be cut. So we do still have to deal with larger structural offsets, how you pay for that, how you grow the economy. But we would assume that those benefits will be paid for out of the general fund if the trust funds do run out of money.
So when you think about getting a return on investment, so you said we're going to make these investments, then we're going to get a return. How do you see that we get a return? When you look at the numbers, we never get to a balanced budget.
A balanced budget is certainly one goal, a goal you speak to. I think another goal is to make sure that we're flattening the curve and debt as a percentage of GDP does not grow. But we also do really care about, and most economists tell us it's a better indicator to look at what we're paying on real debt service. And we do think those payments will remain low, but we also think we need to grow the economy, which these investments would do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Young. First, just want to share a few comments similar to what several of my colleagues have already shared, just in thanking you for the 2022 budget, which as crafted, have no doubt will accelerate our recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, and more importantly, as you pointed out, help us build a more equitable and prosperous economy for all Americans. I believe the president is rightfully rejecting the failed theory of trickle-down economics and instead making strategic investments to help families enter and stay in the middle class. So with all due respect to some of my colleagues' newfound concern about deficits and debt, I know that this proposal meets this moment to rebuild our nation's infrastructure, combat climate change, create millions of good-paying jobs, reduce income and wealth inequality, expand access to child care, redress systemic inequities, and so much more. So I look forward to working with you and the other members of this committee and others to advance this bold vision to deliver the equitable investments that the American people so direly need. I do have a couple questions, a couple in the category of wildfires. I'm from California, and another in regards to housing. First, wildfires. California's most recent wildfire season was the worst on record, with more than 4.2 million acres burned. And we know that without bold action to combat climate change and to improve the resiliency of high-risk areas, we'll continue to see more severe and frequent wildfires. It's important to recognize that 50% of forest land in California is owned by the federal government. So wildland fire management in California is indeed a federal issue. Unfortunately, we've seen decades of underinvestment by the federal government. So I'm pleased to see that the U.S. Forest Service's budget request proposes a $400 million climate funding allocation to accelerate the restoration of degraded forests and rangelands. In total, the U.S. Forest Service proposes an increase of $170 million for wildland fire management and $80 million for its wildfire suppression operations fund. Director Young, simple yes, no question. Will you commit to working with Congress and the Department of Agriculture to ensure that the Forest Service's Region 5 receives the additional staffing and resources it needs to address the hazardous fuels backlog and reduce risk in California?
Yes, sir.
All right. Next, I want to call your attention specifically to ongoing delays in transferring critical wildfire air tankers from the Air Force to CAL FIRE for fire suppression efforts. The Air Force was directed in the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act to modify 7 Coast Guard HC-130H aircraft with state-of-the-art wildfire suppression equipment and transfer them to California for use by CAL FIRE. Delays in transferring these 7 air tankers are especially troubling because of the crucial role that air assets play in fighting California wildfires. So given the severe wildfire season anticipated now and in the foreseeable future, will you commit to working with my office to expedite the congressionally mandated retrofit and transfer of these aircraft?
We will call those agencies and work with you and to see where we are.
Thank you so much. And in my final minute, I want to get to the issue of affordable housing and homelessness. As our nation begins to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic and the American Rescue Plan continues to deliver critical relief in our communities, our longstanding affordable housing and homelessness crises are returning to the forefront. California needs to build an estimated 3.5 million new homes to meet the demand for new housing. And that's just California. According to a recent analysis by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, more than 1.8 million California renters had not been able to catch up on their rent as of mid-May. And the lack of affordable housing and rising rents are pushing more and more people into homelessness. There's now more than 160,000 individuals experiencing homelessness in California. So the need to make significant long-term investments sort of speaks for itself. I'm pleased that the Department of Housing and Urban Development's budget incorporates the President's American Jobs Plan and calls for investing $147 billion to bolster the nation's housing infrastructure while creating jobs. Director Young, will you commit to ensuring that the administration continues to push for essential investments in affordable housing as we work in advancing the infrastructure package?
Yes, Senator, and also pleased that we have a significant voucher increase in the discretionary budget.
Yes, which has also been very, very helpful. So thank you for your leadership and your work. Look forward to working with you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Romney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Young, you said a moment ago that the 2017 tax cut didn't do what it claimed it would do. I would note that prior to COVID, I believe the economy was at a record level of growth and record levels of low unemployment for minorities and for the entire population. So I would think, I wasn't here in 2017, didn't vote for that tax plan, but I think those who did would say actually it was doing what it said it would do. COVID came, and I don't believe the tax cut was related to COVID. Do you of course, recognize that every country, every major developed country in the world has a capital gains rate, tax rate lower than ordinary income rate. And the reason they do that, I presume, is because they want to encourage individuals and entities to make risky investments, because starting a business, for instance, is a risky thing to do, or investing in basic research is a risky thing to do. And so rather than having people just put their money in the bank and earning interest, they want them to do things that if you will, create new businesses and new jobs. The President's plan suggests that we're not going to have a lower tax rate for capital gains. Do you believe there's a relationship between growth and capital gains tax rates?
Senator Romney, clearly we have maybe a difference of opinion on capital gains. We are trying to ensure that what you pay based on your labor, your work, is taxed at the same as your investment income, which a lot of Americans don't have the opportunity to have. So is there inherent unfairness that I would pay more taxes based on the work that I do every day, and those who might be the wealthiest pay half that in some instances because of the investment income they get? We clearly think so, and we think those things should be more equal.
So you think that unlike every other developed country in the world, we should have the same tax rate, or actually a higher tax rate, for investment in risky startup businesses and so forth than we do for ordinary income?
I think some of the things you heard Senator Padilla talk about, some of the inherent issues we had as an economy before
I think
COVID.
that's a yes or no. Does that mean you believe that in fact there should be a higher tax rate on capital gains than ordinary income?
We do. We think it should be taxed close to labor.
I would note that I think, do you not believe that capital gains tax rates relate to growth? You said that the best way to get out of the deficit we have is high growth, but if we have the highest capital gains tax rates in the world, do you think that might depress growth?
We think middle class is an avenue to growth, and this would allow us to put more income or resources into infrastructure, into education, rather than allowing the wealthy to pay, in some instances, half or even less than half of working Americans.
Well, don't forget that the top 10% earners in America are paying 71% of the income tax. Is that not their fair share? Is that you keep saying they should pay their fair share, they should pay their fair share. What is the fair share that should be paid by the top 10% of Americans? If 71% is too low, will you say what share it should be?
Senator Roman, I think you have to look at what they're making compared to what they're paying, and I think most Americans would find it objectionable given the percentage they're paying of their income. I think CEOs now make close to 300
it's noted
times more than
53% of Americans pay no income tax at all. So, and should that number get higher? Should there be a higher percent that pays no income tax at all?
We should have to compare that to what they make compared to the top 1% and what they're making.
Well, you know what the numbers are in terms of the top 10% earn 40% of the income and are paying 71% of the taxes. And so should they be paying 80% of the taxes, 85, 90?
I think we have to look at what they're paying compared to what they make, which is, I know it's hard to believe, but they are not paying the same percentage as workers.
Well, when you say they're not paying the same percentage as workers, 53% of Americans pay no income tax at all. So if 53% of Americans are not paying any tax, how is it those top 10% are paying a higher share? I mean, so I would note that it would be helpful to understand exactly where you think we ought to go to reach a fair share. Let me ask one more thing, and this is just simple math. I guess my time's almost up, and that is, you're proposing that the capital gains tax be applied at death, that the so-called tax run-up at death, tax adjustment at death is eliminated, and they should pay a capital gains tax. Help me with this. If, let's say, an individual, a woman died, let's say her $1 million exemption was being used elsewhere, and so she went from, had an asset that she bought for dollars, now worth $1 million. I just want to do the math here. So she would then pay the capital gains tax of 43.4% on that $1 million, as I understand it, which would be $434,000. And then she'd also pay, when I say she, her estate, would also pay an inheritance tax on the $1 million, which would be $400,000. So in total, she would pay, her estate would pay $834,000 on a $1 million gain, or some 83%. Does that doesn't seem like fair share to me. That seems like confiscatory. Have I missed the math somehow on that?
I would say if you look at it in maybe in more round numbers, if I want to leave a $5 million house to a child, $2.5 million remains tax-free. So there is $1 million, you point out, exemption per individual.
Yeah, I understand. And so I'm talking about an individual that has multiple assets, but it's saying that once that $1 million has been used up, that at that point, the 83% tax rate is a fair share, not confiscatory.
I mean, you have to look at the exemption, which is $1 million.
Senator Whitehouse, I believe, is with us on
I
video.
am with you, Chairman. Thank you very much. Hello, Director Young. How are you?
Hi, Senator.
I wanted to talk with you a little bit about
I'll let you take that.
climate risk. As you recall, at your confirmation hearing, we talked about the economic risks of climate change and the almost amazing array of very serious warnings coming out of banks, economists, insurance companies, Freddie Mac, all sorts of sovereign and central banks. And since then, Swiss Re, the humongous reinsurer, has put out a report in which it concluded that if we did not successfully mitigate carbon pollution, global GDP would be 18% lower in 2050 than it otherwise would be. 18% lower than it otherwise would be. That's essentially 1 in every $5 coming out of the global economy. And I would note that there's no basis to believe that the trajectory between now and 2050, as we got to 18% less GDP, would be gentle. In fact, there's every reason to believe that at some point in that period, the transition or transitions would be abrupt and would be sudden and would provide economic shock to the system. What I would like you to do is to comment a little bit on when you hear about an 18% loss of GDP, what kind of human and economic casualties does that cause? And what do those scenarios look like if you add in the element of suddenness, of abruptness, of shock? I mean, it's bad enough if we went on a smooth trajectory to having 18% less GDP in the world than we otherwise would have. But if it all happens in a calamitous shock, that obviously worsens things considerably. So if you could reflect on those and give me your thoughts, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. The president stated many times the belief that climate change is an existential threat from our national defense. To look at what we're spending now on disaster relief. I'm a South Louisiana. The money we have to invest to make sure that our coastline doesn't continue to slip into the Gulf of Mexico. I see Senator Kennedy here, so I'm reluctant to talk about our home state. But
if I could interrupt for 1 second, Ms. Young, I think the quotation from the New Orleans newspaper from the scientist about this was really simple with regard to South Louisiana. If I recall correctly, it was, "We're screwed." So I sympathize, but go ahead and answer your question.
So what we haven't done in this budget, but I think others have in academia, is see what the economic effects would be for climate change. Look, the few investments we're making here and the impact it has on the top line is nothing compared to if we allow this, with one state we see what the fiscal hit would be, and the economy could not continue if we allowed climate change to continue in that manner along the coast. So there's no doubt to me that this spending is necessary to see if we can even catch up to what we've unfortunately allowed to happen around the world with regard to climate change. And we see it as not a partisan issue. It is certainly one that has attracted partisan rancor, but I think anyone who lives along a coast can see not only the human impact, but the economic impact it has on those who live there, who work there, and it can't continue.
And for the record, there is not, nor ever has been, serious dispute about the basic elements of this in the scientific community. The dispute was manufactured by the oil and gas industry and its front groups in order to create political space for itself. Last quick question. Have you ever seen revenue? Has America ever seen revenues at a similar share of our economy to what President Biden is proposing? And if so, how was the economy doing back then, and how was the budget doing back then?
Senator Whitehouse, I think the important thing is when everyone, talks about debt, and we absolutely have to look at debt as a share of GDP, but it would be unfair to not look at the revenue side of the ledger to make sure that we aren't falsely restricting ourselves to make investments in climate, in infrastructure, and make sure we do see a role for the wealthiest Americans. We do see a tax rate where they are paying less than working Americans as a percentage of what they bring in. We do see the use of loopholes and offshoring that keep us from investing in areas that both parties agree on.
But at the macro level, when we last saw revenues at around 20% of GDP, we had a booming economy and budget surpluses, correct?
Okay, Sheldon? All right, thank you. Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Director, how are you? Good. I'm going to fuss a little bit, but I'm not fussing at you. I'm one of your big fans. But I suspect you can get the White House on the phone quicker than I can. If I make it to heaven, the first question, or at least one of the first questions I'm going to ask, is why do bad things happen to good people? But they do. And as Americans, when that does happen, we help each other. That's why we spend about $1 trillion a year helping American citizens who are less fortunate. Some bad things happen to good people in Southwest Louisiana, as you know. We were hit by Hurricane Laura and Hurricane Delta in a very short period of time. And if you go even today, a year ago, they hit, it still looks like a fantastic impression of hell. We've asked President Biden for block grant disaster relief. And in the Senate, as you know, Congress and the House can move on its own, but in the Senate, we have to have a request from the White House. We don't have to, it's more custom than statute, but many of my Democratic colleagues, when I lobby them on getting some assistance, they say, well, what's the White House's position? And I don't blame them. If the shoe were on the other foot, that's what I would ask. We can't get an answer from President Biden about our request. We've begged, we've pleaded, we've cajoled. I talked directly with the president when he honored us by coming to our state in New Orleans. Let me choose my words carefully here. I want to be candid, but I don't want to be ugly. Look, I understand politics. I get that. And I'm not saying that the president's decision is based on politics. But we live in a political world. And I understand that President Biden didn't carry Louisiana in the last election. I'm not saying that's dispositive of his decision or lack thereof. But a lot of people who really stuck their necks out for President Biden are very supportive of this request. Governor John Bel Edwards in my state, who happens to be a Democrat, he supported President Biden enthusiastically. My colleague, Congressman Cedric Richmond, supported President Biden enthusiastically. They went way out on a limb for him. And they deserve, and the people of Louisiana deserve an answer. Now, obviously, I hope the answer from the president is yes. But we deserve an answer. And I can't get one. Can you help me?
Senator Kennedy, I'm going to give you an answer. And we absolutely, for every Democratic senator, Republican senator, we want to see aid move to Louisiana and every other state. I believe the last time, which I worked on the congressional side, the last disaster declaration or disaster package that moved through Congress took care of the front half of 2019 storms. We don't earmark disaster storms because there's no room for politics in disaster response, period.
Agreed.
Absolutely. So we need to do something for those storms for the second half of 2019 and 2020 up to date. Not a disagreement on strategy, but I worked on the Hill for a long time, moved disaster bills. We didn't get a disaster supplemental request from an administration. But let me put clearly on the record, we support moving aid for Louisiana and every other state that's been hit by declaration since the last time we passed a supplemental.
Could you ask the president to send us a letter to that?
I believe he asked me to respond, and you may have
Yes, ma'am, and I got your letter.
Yeah.
No disrespect, but it didn't say that.
Yeah, the president asked me to call the mayor of Lake Charles, which I did, and we had a great conversation of Baton Rouge, my home city.
Could you send me a letter, or better, or let the president send, however you want to do it, that says categorically, unequivocally, unconditionally, I support the block grant disaster relief for southwest Louisiana with respect to Hurricanes Laura and Delta?
Yep, I thought we did that, but I'm happy
No,
to
ma'am.
do it in more stronger terms.
Would you?
Yeah, we
You want me to
absolutely
you want me to
believe
draft the
help
letter for you?
Nope.
Okay.
Help is needed, Senator, and we're
Thank you,
there
Madam
with you.
Director. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Let me thank Ms. Young. It's been a long morning. And thank you very much for being with us today. And her full written statement will be included in the record. As information for all senators, questions for the record are due by 12 o'clock noon tomorrow, with signed hard copies delivered to the committee clerk in Dirksen 624. Email copies will also be accepted under our rules. Ms. Young will have 7 days from receipt of our questions to respond with answers. With no further business before the committee, this hearing is adjourned.